All right, let's get cooking. Welcome to the latest edition of Chin Check Sports Radio. I'm your host, JD. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to join us. And as always, we welcome any suggestions, feedback, comments, and criticisms, which improves the quality of our program, which ultimately improves your listening experience. Before we get started, I want to send all of you, thank you for your tremendous support. People are slowly finding out about who we are and what we do. They enjoy and respect the passion with which we speak. But we do this because we love it, as we are simply sharing our passion with you all as we continue to build our listening army to take over the world. We definitely want to continue with our Chin Check Radio top 10 boxing upset list of all time based on the fights that we grew up watching. And folks, putting this list together has been extremely fun. We are having a great time doing it. It is a stroll down memory lane. And as we constantly say, even as we do our broadcast and we post on YouTube for your enjoyment, we are literally still putting the list in numerical order because that is how difficult it is to place this type of list together. And we wanted to be a fair, nice list, and I don't want to say fair and nice, but a list that you can really say, you know what, some thought was put into it because we really did put our thought into it based on our criteria. So next up that we're going to talk about is the fight between Mexican icon and perhaps the greatest Mexican fighter of all time, Julio Cesar Chaves Sr. against Frankie the Surgeon Randall from January 29th, 1994. Now, what was interesting about this night is going to be a few things. Frankie Randall, going into this fight, had a total record of 48 wins, 2 losses, 1 draw, and 39 knockouts. Chavez, meanwhile, had a total of 89 wins, no losses, 1 draw, and 77 knockouts. Frankie Randall was 32 years of age. Chavez was 31 years of age. Now, let me also throw this in there already. The late Frankie Randall, who passed away in 2020. Now, going to this fight, Frankie Randall had a couple of fights against former titleists. One, Freddie Pendleton, and the late boxing Hall of Famer, Edwin Rosario. So, believe it or not, reading his resume and knowing about Frankie Randall, that was his first time fighting for a world title. Now, Frankie Randall has fought for some other regional titles, the NABF title, the USBA title, but the first time fighting for whether it be the WBA, IBF, or the WBC, at the time the 3 recognized world sanctioning bodies, title belts. So the first time going into this fight, first time fighting Chavez, first time fighting for a world title. So let that sink in. 48 wins, 2 losses, so 50 professional fights, and first time fighting for a world title. Believe it or not, folks, that's actually how it was a lot of times back then. You didn't fight for your first world title until maybe 30-something fights or 40 fights. So think of how times have changed. Chavez, the record speaks for itself. Now, we've always stated that we caught the tail end of Chavez's career, but this guy had fights against Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, Greg Haugen, the late Hector Macho Camacho, Meldrick Taylor, Sammy Fuentes, the late Roger Mayweather, Jose Luis Ramirez, the aforementioned Edwin Rosario, the late Rocky Lockridge. So, the man's record speaks for itself. But going into this fight was held at the MGM Grand. The first fight ever at the MGM Grand. And now let that sink in. First fight at the MGM Grand, that is the equivalent of the Madison Square Garden for boxing on the West Coast. I myself have gone to the MGM Grand, the Grand Garden Arena. We watched Mosey Mayweather. Think of the countless boxing matches and later on UFC fights that was held at that great arena. So this fight here was the first fight ever for the grand opening of the MGM Grand Garden Arena. So just a funny thing in history. So going into this fight, it was really all about Chavez trying to get that 90th win, going up against the guy who was a serviceable opponent, who worked his way up to have a title shot. We know that Chavez and Don King had a rather unique relationship with the head of the WBC, one Jose Suleiman. So that's a whole another conversation about boxing politics. If you watched the Showtime broadcast that had the late fight doctor Bertie Pacheco, Steve Albert, and one Bobby Chiz, when asked, and now Bertie Pacheco was, and the reason why he was named the fight doctor, because he was a fight doctor for the late, great Muhammad Ali. He was in Ali's corner during the time Ali's rise in the 60s and the 70s, along with Angelo Dundee, along with one Boudini Brown. As after Ali fought the Thrill of Manila, of course, as a fight doctor told Ali he needs to retire. Of course, Ali didn't take the advice. Later on, as he reconciled, once Ali told Bertie Pacheco that, hey, you were right. So the fight doctor was a voice on Showtime boxing during the 1990s. So if you think of that HBO with Jim Lampley and Larry Merchant, the functional equivalent on Showtime was Steve Albert, the fight doctor, as well as one Bobby Chiz. So going into that fight, when he asked Bertie Pacheco about Frankie Randall's chances, the fight doctor even stated he really didn't see much of a chance because Chavez himself had been in there with left-handers, right-handers, tall guys, hard punchers, where with 89 wins on one's record, of course, you pretty much have seen it all in the sport of professional boxing. So even the commentators felt that there wasn't much of a chance that Randall had going into this fight, as well as the odds makers at a 15-1 underdog didn't give Randall much of a chance going into this fight. So that's the background before both fighters get into the ring. Now, as we play the video for those of you watching on YouTube, Frankie Randall came out and won the first 3 rounds. Now, if you look at the first round, it was more of a feeling out process, as Chavez was a notorious slow starter, trying to figure his man out. Frankie Randall boxing, utilizing angles, footwork, and some lateral movement, clearly took something from the blueprint of the late Pernell Whitaker, who fought Chavez a year before, and based on activity, won the first round. Began to open up a little bit in the second round, with clearly landing hard punches to the head. So he was a much more active fighter in the first 3 rounds. So by any scorecard, you could have given the first 3 rounds to Frankie Randall. Now, of course, watching Chavez back then, those first 3 rounds meant nothing because he was putting money in the bank, landed his patented left hook to the body, breaking his opponents down little by little. But remember watching that fight, I was noticing that, well, wait a minute. Randall himself is hitting Chavez. He's hitting Chavez to the body, which a lot of people didn't do that, being that Chavez's style was to constantly come forward. Yes, he had a high guard, but his guard was a little open, so you can land a lot of headshots, but nobody was really attacking Chavez's body like I saw Randall doing it. But of course, even though Randall came out and won the first 3 rounds, you knew that he was going to be in for a tough fight because Chavez kept coming at you. He kept making the fight. If you're scoring a boxing match, effective aggression, and he kept walking forward, and he has had the benefit of some generous judging in terms of his boxing fights. So Chavez, giving away the first 3 rounds, has now come back, in my eyes, has now won the 4th, 5th, and the 6th round just based on effective aggression and clean, hard punching, mixing up his left hook to the body as well as to the head, dropping in the occasional right hand as Frankie Randall became more of a stationary target. That was Chavez's chance to do some tremendous infighting. And for those of you who don't know about Chavez, he wasn't what we would call a one-punch knockout artist like a Mike Tyson or a Julian Jackson. He just had a style where it would just constantly just wear you down. So he had heavy hands that would literally just wear his opponents down, break their will, and just break their spirits. So again, Chavez winning the 4th, 5th, and the 6th round. In the 7th round, as Chavez still has the advantage, he hits Frankie Randall with a low blow. Now, Randall, you can make an argument, was actually winning that 7th round. I thought he was winning the 7th round, so now you're up 10-9. You have a point deducted from Chavez for a low blow, and it was a clear low blow. Now you've scored a 10-8 round. So now Chavez is 2 rounds behind. I can give the 8th and the 9th round to Frankie Randall, again, based on activity, based on cleaner punching, landing upstairs, landing downstairs, seemingly showing no fear of one Chavez. And it was an interesting dynamic because you thought, much like the Meldrick Taylor fight, that Frankie Randall is dominating Chavez, but again, the fight is never over until it's over. And one thing that we forgot to mention, and please forgive us for that, the assigned referee for this fight was Richard Steele. If that name sounds familiar, it's the same Richard Steele who stopped the fight controversially against Meldrick Taylor. The same Meldrick Taylor who was beating Chavez, but Chavez broke Taylor down physically, scores a knockdown with about 2 to 3 seconds left as Taylor gets up. And of course, and HBO did a great job on this show, Legendary Fights, and please watch that Chavez and Taylor fight. But Richard Steele was the referee for that fight, and if you guys don't know, Richard Steele had been involved in some other bizarre incidents in the ring, controversial stoppages regarding Don King fighters, because at that time, Don King was probably the most powerful promoter in boxing by far. So just a little bit of history to really put that into context. So now we have Randall winning the 8th and the 9th round. So now he's building a sizable lead on the scorecards. However, again, this is still Chavez coming forward, still landing his body punches, still seemingly breaking Randall down. In the 10th round, I gave the 10th round to Chavez because Randall kind of took the round off. You start to maybe see, okay, is Randall breaking down? Has the body punches that Chavez has put in the bank, is it starting to pay dividends now? Has it slowed his activity down? So now watching this fight coming up, I'm thinking, okay, now Chavez is not going to turn the tide. He's going to start to break him down in the later championship rounds. The fact that Randall has now given away the 10th round. Now, even watching the fight, you would think that Chavez would need a knockout, but again, Chavez has had the benefit of judges of some questionable scoring on his side. And so you were starting to think, it looks like that Randall is winning this fight, but is he going to win the fight? So the 11th round comes. Chavez has another point deducted for a low blow, an actual right call. So considering that the referee, Richard Steele, has had other issues in the past regarding Don King promoted fighters, the 2 points that he deducted from Chavez, we felt was actually the right call. Of course, Chavez is frustrated as they box back in the center of the ring. Frankie Randall lands a perfect 1-2. I'm talking about right down the middle. Right on the chin, flush on the chin, drops Chavez. And folks, that was the first knockdown in the career of Julio Cesar Chaves. Let this sink in, ladies and gentlemen. That knockdown against Frankie Randall in 90 professional fights was his first knockdown ever in his career. So now we've got a 2-point swing that now we had a point deducted, and now we have a knockdown. So now at this point, and even the late Verdi Pacheco said on commentary, goodbye title. And at that point, unless Chavez knocked Randall out in the last round, there was no way, based on points, that Randall was supposed to win. That Chavez was going to win that fight other than knocking Randall out. And in the last round, of course, at that point, it was really a moot point. And clearly by unanimous decision, Frankie Randall should have won the fight. But remember how we said earlier that Chavez has gotten the benefit of judging in some of his fights? Would you believe that one judge scored a fight 114-113 for Randall, literally only having Randall by 1 point, and that even includes the knockdown and the points taken away from low blows. One judge had it 116-111. I actually can agree with that scorecard. And one judge actually scored the fight 114-113 for Chavez. Let that sink in, ladies and gentlemen. A judge watching that fight scored that fight, had Chavez winning that fight, and nobody watching that fight can even let you to believe that Chavez won that fight. So again, that's why we say Chavez has had the benefit of judges, certain judges or WBC judges scoring this fight. So a tremendous victory for one Frankie Randall. And sometimes in life, folks, you can be great for one night and you live in eternity. And that's exactly what Frankie Randall did. Everything lined up for him. He fought a beautiful fight. Even in his corner towards the end of the later rounds, he was like, yeah, I'm winning this fight and I'm going to win this fight. He did not bend or succumb to the pressure of Chavez's will. He stayed in there. He fought tough. He returned fire. So when he was hit, he actually returned fire. And again, that one night, the first man to ever defeat Chavez, quote, officially, the first man to ever knock Chavez down. And the late Frankie Randall deserves to be on this list because that was a shocking upset. Now, you're probably going to ask me, well, Chincheck, why is it so low on your list? Well, a couple of reasons why. Well, the reason why it's even on the list in the first place, because again, a 15-1 underdog, 18-1 underdog, first time going into a championship fight. Well, I think at the time Chavez had about almost 40 championship fights. So Chavez had almost as many championship fights than Frankie Randall had professional fights. So everything favored Chavez. So that's why it even made the list. Now, the reason why it's so low, even though it was an official loss for Chavez, we have mentioned this before, we truly believe that he lost the fight against Pernell Whitaker. We truly believe that an awful draw in San Antonio, Texas. We truly believe that Meldrick Taylor, he should have won that fight. And it's something that when you watch the HBO series, The Legendary Fights, they even said had the fight not been stopped, Chavez would have won Taylor would have won on a split decision. But again, that was funny because anybody watching that fight knows that Chavez barely won around that fight, maybe except the 10th, 11th, and obviously the 12th round with the knockdowns. But his scorecard was so far that Taylor clearly won that fight. He clearly lost against Whitaker, so that's why it's so low because, yes, even though he lost the fight and it rocked the boxing world, but us growing up, we felt that this loss was a long time coming because, again, he should have been beaten in 1990. He should have been beaten in 1993. It finally caught up with him. It finally caught up with him in 94. But, folks, it is an excellent fight. You should really go back and watch this fight in its entirety, despite the video footage that was showing on YouTube. And folks, it was a great fight. And again, Frankie Randall for one night put it all together, fought the fight of his life, and will ever go down in history as a first man to defeat Chavez. And again, Chavez was 31 years old, so we're not talking about Chavez's losses later on in the career to the Cossazoos and the Oscar de la Hoyas as an elder statesman. We're talking about a guy who's 31 years old, still maybe somewhat not in his prime, but still the top pound-for-pound fight in the world. We're talking a guy with 89 wins, a heavy favorite going into that fight. And afterwards, they did fight a rematch again due to a clash of heads, from funny scoring. Chavez ended up winning that fight, and the late Frankie Randall didn't have much of a career. He was chosen as Chavez's final opponent before his retirement, and he lost a 10-round decision. But again, for one night on January 29th, 1994, the late Frankie, the Surgeon Randall, fought the fight of his life in beating one of the greatest fighters in boxing history, the greatest Mexican fighter in boxing history, to be the first man to ever knock him down, the first man to ever beat him officially, and beat him convincingly, whether the scorecards really shouldn't have been that close, to beat him convincingly. So for any Frankie Randall fans or family listening to this broadcast, just know that his memory is never forgotten. His spirit will live on forever because he fought the fight of his life. And until the next time, it's Chin Check Radio, signing out.